Sairam students, today we have come up with a new chapter, that is chapter number 8, The Pandavas in Exile. So students, all of you be ready with a pen and a notebook to write all the important points that we are going to learn today. Now this chapter is taken from Mahabharata, which is one of the major Sanskrit epics of ancient India. As such, there is no writer for this particular chapter, but we all know traditionally the authorship of the Mahabharata is attributed to Saint Vyas. Now before we start with the chapter, let us first understand the central idea of the chapter. This lesson is an extract from Mahabharata narrated by Saint Vyasa. This chapter reveals the character of Yudhishthira, his endurance, kind-heartedness, affection for his brothers, and intellect. Yudhishthira satisfies Yaksha by giving satisfactory answers to his questions. The Yaksha was pleased with Yudhishthira's fairness. And then the Yaksha, who was Yama, the lord of death, who had taken the form of Yaksha to see Yudhishthira and test his knowledge. Now, being satisfied with his answer, Yama blessed him and he disappeared. Now students, let's start with this chapter. The story so far goes something like this. In Hastinapur, there lived two brothers, Dhritarashtra and Pandu. Though Pandu was younger, he was enthroned as the king because Dhritarashtra was blind. Pandu had 5 sons named Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula and Sahadeva from his 2 wives Kunti and Madri. They were called the Pandavas. Dhritarashtra had 100 sons from Gandhari, and Duryodhana being the eldest, they were called the Kauravas. When Pandu died, Dhritarashtra became the king of Hastinapur. There emerged an intense rivalry between the 2 sets of cousins because Yudhishthira was the rightful heir to the thrones of Hastinapur. After trying various ways to get rid of his cousins from poison to fire, finally Duryodhana's maternal uncle Shakuni devises a plot to trap Pandavas and take away their kingdom through deceit. Shakuni, a master player in Chaucer, a game of dice, insists Duryodhana to invite Yudhishthira for a game expressing his desire to make amends. Yudhishthira happily agrees, but he is defeated and ends up losing not only his entire kingdom but also his brothers, along with his own self and their queen Draupadi. When Draupadi is about to curse the entire Kaurava clan, she is stopped by King Dhritarashtra. He asks for forgiveness and returns all assets back to Yudhishthira. Kauravas insist on playing a fair game, to which Yudhishthira agrees and almost wins before losing the game yet again. Yudhishthira accepts the condition that the defeated party should go with his brothers and wife into exile to the forest and remain there for 12 years and spend the 13th year incognito. For 12 years, the 5 brothers and Draupadi suffers, but have many adventures. At last, the 13th year approaches, and they had one last adventure in the forest. Now students, the Mahabharata is an ancient Indian epic where the main story revolves around two branches of family, that is the Pandavas and Kauravas. But here this chapter talks about Yudhishthira's character. Now the story begins something like this. In Hastinapur, there lived two brothers, Dhritarashtra and Pandu. Now since Dhritarashtra was blind, Pandu became the king of Hastinapur. Pandu had two wives, Kunti and Madri. From Kunti, he had three children. Elder one named as Yudhishthira, then Bhima and Arjuna. And from Madri, he had two children, Nakula and Sahadeva. And they all were altogether known as Pandavas. Whereas Dhritarashtra had 100 sons from Gandhari, and Duryodhana was the eldest, and they all were called as Kauravas. After Pandu died, Dhritarashtra became the king of Hastinapur. Now after this, there was an intense competition between these two sets of cousins, as Pandavas felt that Yudhishthira was the righteous heir to the throne of Hastinapur. Kaurava tried various ways to get rid of Pandavas. One day, Shakuni, that is Duryodhana's maternal and wicked uncle, he planned to trap Pandavas and take away their kingdom. He asked Duryodhana to invite Yudhishthira to play a game of Chaucer. Chaucer is an evil game of dice. Shakuni knew Yudhishthira was not good in this game, whereas Shakuni was expert in this evil game. Before the game started, they kept certain desires which needs to be fulfilled if Pandavas loses the game. At the beginning, Yudhishthira happily agrees, but then later on he was defeated and he ends up losing himself, his entire kingdom, his brothers and their wife Draupadi. Draupadi was dragged into the court of Hastinapur, and it was then Duryodhana ordered one of his brothers to strip off Draupadi's clothes to avenge the insult that he had to endure in the palace of the Pandavas. Later, Draupadi was very angry. She was just about to curse the entire Kaurava group. But somehow she was stopped by the king Dhritarashtra. He requested to forgive everyone, and he also returned all the assets back to Yudhishthira, which he lost in this evil game. Except one condition, as they were defeated, that he should go with his brothers and wife into exile, that is, separation from one's native country to the forest, and remain there for 12 years and spend the 13th year in disguise. For 12 years, these 5 brothers and Draupadi suffers a lot, but they had an adventurous life. On the last 13th year, they have one last adventure in the forest. Now students, let's read further and understand the adventure. Another time it happened that the Pandava brothers, going in pursuit of a deer in the forest, wandering far from their dwelling place. The sun was hot overhead and they grew thirsty. The deer had vanished and now footsore and weary. They came at last to a stop, knowing that their search was in vain. Their mouths were parched. They scanned the earth in all directions for some sight of water, but seeing none, they trudged wearily onward until at last Yudhishthira, unable to go any further due to fatigue, sank down under a tree to rest and sent Sahadeva in search of water for them. Now students, let us learn few new words. Pursued means spot. Parched means very dry. Weary means extremely tired. Trot means walk slowly and with heavy steps. Then, assets means a useful or valuable things or person. Incognito means disguised. Then, exile means the state of being barred from one's native country. Then is vain. Vain means producing no result or useless. After that is fatigue. Fatigue means extreme tiredness resulting from mental or physical exertion. Now, these 5 brothers were hunting a deer in the forest and they were wandering far away from their reside place. It was sunny day and they grew thirsty. The deer also disappeared, and since they walked so long, they all were extremely tired. Their foot sore, that is, they had a raw and painful feet from much walking. They all were so thirsty that their mouths were very dry. They looked around for the water, but there was no sign of water. In search for water, they moved ahead with heavy, tired steps. But Yudhishthira was extremely tired. He was unable to move further and felt drowsy. He just sat down under a tree to rest and asked Sahadeva to search water for them. Now, let's read further, students. The youth went readily enough, but when he did not return for a long time, Yudhishthira grew concerned. He sent Nakula to see what had happened and also to find water. Nakula obeyed, but he too, like Sahadeva, did not return. Then Yudhishthira sent his remaining brothers one by one after each other. But when they all went and none returned, he grew very anxious, not knowing what evil fate had overtaken them. At last, he decided to go and see for himself. He got up and, following their footsteps, went down the track. Now students, let's learn these new words. Fate. Fate means the development of events outside a person's control. Then the next is anxious. Anxious means worried. Now students, here we understand, as soon as Sahadeva got order from his brother Yudhishthira to fetch water, young Sahadeva readily walked for a distance until he came to a pool in a forest. But it was long time past, he did not return. Now Yudhishthira was really concerned and worried. He then asked Nakula to see what had happened and also asked him to find water as he was extremely thirsty. Nakula obeyed and he went in search of his brother Sahadeva as well as for water. But to his surprise, even he did not return. Now this time Yudhishthira was extremely worried. He then sent Bhima and then Arjuna in search of water as well as for their brothers. But there was no change in the scenario. None of his brother returned. Now Yudhishthira grew very anxious as he was not knowing what evil action had overtaken them. Finally, he got up and decided he himself will find out his brothers, as well as water. He started following their footsteps and went down the track. Now students, let's read further. He walked down for a distance until he came to a pool in a clearing. Its clear, still waters reflected the blue sky, while the pink and white and blue lotuses that grew in it raised their smiling heads to the sun. But as his eyes looked upon the lovely scene, Yudhishthira saw another sight that made his blood freeze in his veins. For upon the earth lay his 4 brothers, cold and still, either dead or unconscious. Their eyes were closed, and when he called to them, they would not answer. Sorrow filled the king's heart, and he fell on his knees by them and wept bitterly for them, wringing his hands in his grief and crying out to heaven to take him too, for he could not live without his brothers. Now students, let's look at few new words. Wringing. Wringing means extremely wet or soaked. Then is grief. Grief means sorrow. Then is unconscious. Unconscious means senseless. Students, here we understand when Yudhishthira went in search of his brothers down the track, he walked until he reached a pool in the forest. At that moment, he was amazed to see a clear, still water which had a reflection of blue sky with amazing pink and white and blue blossom lotuses. Yudhishthira was astonished with the lovely scene, and then he saw another sight which made him frightened. He saw all his 4 brothers lying on the earth with their body cold and placed still. He was unable to understand the evil act that might have taken place with them. He could not understand whether they are dead or unconscious. He tried calling them, but no one answered him. He was so depressed that he cried bitterly. He cried out to heaven to take him too, as he felt his brothers are no more, and there's no use of living alive if his brothers are not there with him. Alright students, I will stop this chapter here and we will continue with this chapter in our next online session. Now it's time for assignment. As you all know, you will be getting a link. You need to complete your assignment and then click on submit button. Alright, Sai Ram.